Hello, everyone. My name is Genevieve Pugesek. I'm a fifth-year graduate student at Tufts University studying under Dr. Elizabeth Crone. And today I'm really excited to tell you about one of our projects exploring overwintering habitat associations and survival of queen bumblebees. There is a lot of interest in maintaining and managing habitats for pollinators in order to enhance pollination services for crops and wildflowers. Bombus impatiens is a really important pollinator in the northeastern United States because it's incredibly common. But just because it's common doesn't mean that we understand all of its resource requirements. Bumblebees are a group of pollinators with both a social and a solitary phase of their life cycle. And it's the solitary phase, which begins with overwintering, that we don't understand as well. Bumblebee queens will overwinter and emerge in mid-spring, at which point they will try to find a location at which to nest. After finding a suitable nest site location, queens will establish colonies. This is the beginning of the social phase of their life cycle. And the colony will grow until the late summer or early fall, at which point it will switch into reproduction. The new queens and drones which are produced will mate, and the new queens will go on to overwinter, whereas the rest of the colony will die. And as you can see from this example, bumblebees need different resources at different stages of their life cycle. And we can think of bumblebees as having three main components of habitat. They need sites at which to forage, they need sites at which to overwinter, and they need sites at which to nest. The vast majority of research characterizing habitats for bumblebees focus on foraging resources. We don't know much about the resource requirements for nesting or overwintering bumblebees. Over the past 3 years, I've been exploring the nesting ecology of Bombus impatiens at a couple different sites just outside of Ipswich, Massachusetts. And last year, while we were monitoring some nest sites as they were entering the reproductive phase of their life cycle, we noticed that queen bumblebees were overwintering adjacent to nest site entrances. Within about 4 meters of nest site entrances, we were seeing queens exhibiting this behavior. I was really excited to observe this, and as I delved into the literature a little bit, I realized that other people have observed this too, that Bombus impatiens seems to overwinter in large aggregations. And Bombus impatiens isn't the only social species of bee to do this. There are some social species of sweat bees which overwinter right next to where they nest. And I thought this was a great opportunity to explore the overwintering ecology of Bombus impatiens a little bit more rigorously, because most of these previous observations have been relatively anecdotal. I was interested in two main questions around where these bees are overwintering. Firstly, I wanted to know how far are queens overwintering from nest sites? And second, I wanted to explore if there are any microhabitat characteristics associated with overwintering locations. I also was interested in exploring whether or not we can monitor the survival of queen bumblebees. For lots of insect species, we know that overwintering survival is a really important predictor of population size the next year. But this just isn't a vital rate we've really been able to capture in the field for any Bombus species that I can think of. And so I was really interested in characterizing what proportion of queens were surviving over the winter. To do this, we needed to locate potential overwintering sites. So we searched areas around 3 nest sites from September to October in 2019. And this is when queens were really active and were starting to dig out their hibernaculum. We monitored 3 nests that were found in forests in particular. And what we were looking for was evidence that a queen was using a site to overwinter. And so we were looking for queens that were actively digging, or evidence that a queen had dug out an area, as evidenced by a small queen-sized hole in the ground with a little pile of dirt next to it, as you can see here. We searched 9 quadrats around each nest site for evidence of overwintering by queens. Each quadrat was 4 meters by 4 meters, and we visited quadrats once a week and searched them for a period of about 15 to 20 minutes until the colonies were no longer producing queens. And if you notice here, all the quadrats are at varying distances from the nest site entrance, but we're not searching any farther away than 10 meters from nest sites. Because as I mentioned previously, we were observing overwintering queens within 4 meters from nest sites, and so we wanted to search a larger area than this to capture where they're really overwintering. For each overwintering site that we found, We measured the distance to the natal nest site. We measured the distance to the nearest tree. We also characterized the surrounding vegetative cover in terms of leaf litter, live cover, bare ground, and decaying wood using an 1/8 of a square meter quadrat. We did this for all of the overwintering sites that we found, as well as random points around each nest. And we found that queens just did not overwinter far from nest sites at all. On average, queens were found only 1.58 meters away from their natal nest site. And as we can see here, for each nest site, queens are overwintering about the same distance away. We also found that overwintering sites seem to be closer to trees than the random points that we measured. The random points were on average 1.5 meters away from the nearest tree, whereas the sites that were used by bumblebees were on average a little over 1 meter away from trees. We noted some interesting associations with ground cover, particularly that bumblebees used sites that had a little bit more live cover around them than random sites. I think that this may have been driven by one particular area adjacent to one nest site. So the nest site is marked here in blue, and you can see there's a patch of live cover with probably a lot of little oak saplings where about 1/3 of the overwintering queens we found around this nest site were located. So I think that it's this area that's really driving this pattern. We noted that queens used areas with less woody debris surrounding them compared to the random sites, although the difference between 24% and 20% isn't much. It doesn't seem that queens are avoiding woody debris in a major way, at least. We also noted no difference in the surrounding cover in terms of bare ground between random sites and used sites, although there wasn't that much bare ground to begin with. Only 1% of the surrounding cover around overwintering sites was made up by bare ground in general. So now that we've talked about what's going on above ground, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on below ground. And with that, we're going to answer our last question: what proportion of queens are surviving over the winter? For 1/3 of the potential overwintering sites that we found, we excavated the queen. So we found around 100 potential overwintering sites around each nest. So we excavated about 30 to 33 queens around each nest site. We did this at the end of November in 2019. For each queen that we dug up, we measured her intertegular span, which is the distance between her two wing joints. We weighed her, and then we measured how far she had dug herself into the ground. After taking all of our measurements, we chilled her down, and then we reburied her. And then we revisited the sites in mid-March in 2020 to estimate queen survival. It was pretty obvious when a queen had made it through the winter. Their coats were very pristine, they looked very good, they started moving almost immediately as we started disturbing the soil around them. And the queens that died were mostly found in little bits. Sometimes we would only recover the tag with a little piece of a queen stuck to it. In some cases, we recovered no remains of a queen at all. If we compare the survival of queens from each one of our nest sites, we see that there's a lot of variation. That queens at nest site number 1 did not survive as well as queens that surrounded nest site number 2 and nest site number 3. Only 42% of queens really made it through the winter at nest site number 1, whereas 85% of queens made it through the winter around nest sites 2 and 3. And I want to talk a little bit about why that might be. Queens from nest site number 1 did not overwinter as deeply in the soil as the queens at the 2 other nest sites. On average, queens at nest site number 1 are only overwintering about 5 centimeters below the soil. And this might be because the queens at this nest site were having a hard time digging because the ground is really compacted and it was very rocky because this nest site was really close to a trail. These differences may have also arisen because of differences with seen within the queens themselves. Queens at nest site number 1 were smaller than the queens that we observed at nest site number 2. Here we have the intertegular span on the y-axis. And as you can see, there was a difference between the body size of queens at these different nest sites. We didn't see much of a difference between body size nest site number 1 and nest site number 3. If we look at queen body size as a predictor of soil depth, we see that there's a positive relationship there, that queens with a larger IT span, so queens that are larger, also dug themselves more deeply into the soil. So it may be that both of these things are at play, and both of these things are driving the differences that we're seeing between in survival between these 3 different nest sites. I had a lot of fun with this project, and I think we found a lot of things that really surprised me. We found that queens did not overwinter far from nest sites at all, on average only 1.5 meters away from nest site entrances. We also noted a few interesting microhabitat characteristics, which were associated with overwintering locations. Queens seemed to overwinter near trees and in areas with live cover. We also observed a lot of variation in the proportion of queens to survive over the winter, depending on what nest site they originated from. And if you take away anything from this talk, what I want you to take away is that we shouldn't just characterize where bumblebees are overwintering. We also need to characterize vital rates like survival, because the availability of suitable sites that are not really rocky or with really compacted soil, might impact their vital rates. With that, I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Crone, as well as my collaborator, Jesse Thuma, for all of their help with this project. I would like to thank the Crone and Orion's lab groups for their support, especially Nick Dorian, as well as Nick Rosenberg from the Williams Lab, without whom I don't think this research would have happened, just because of all of the inspiring conversations that I had with them. I would love to take any questions that you have, and thank you so much for listening to this talk.